I'm E.J. Dion. I'm here at Brookings, and on behalf of the Religion, Policy, and Politics Project at Brookings, I want to welcome you all. It has been our pleasure now for some years to work closely with Robbie Jones, Dan Cox, and Yuham Navarro Rivera at the Public Religion Research Institute. This is the third American Values Survey in which we have, in one way or another, worked together, and we hope for many more years of collaboration. This is actually a logical follow-up to work we started back in 2010, where we did a survey on the relationship between the Tea Party and the religious conservative movement. We actually did two surveys that year, one before and one after the 2010 election, where we re-interviewed our respondents. And one of our major findings was the extraordinary overlap between the Tea Party and the religious conservative movement, which at the time wasn't widely discussed. It was felt more that the Tea Party might be more of a libertarian movement. But that left out the libertarians themselves, and so we decided that it would be a great focus this year, because there is wide popular interest these days in libertarianism, and also it's another piece of this coalition. Robbie will present the findings of the survey, and then we will hear from my colleague, Bill Galston, and really three extraordinary respondents, Carlin Bowman, Brink Lindsey, and Henry Olsen. Now, it is said that there's a lot of disputation going on the conservative side of politics. Here at Brookings, we like to bring people together. And so I'm very proud that we have brought more conservative think tanks together in Washington than you usually see in Washington. We have with us today representation from the American Enterprise Institute, from the Cato Institute, and from the Ethics and Public Policy Center. And so we are very grateful that you're here. We'll have a conversation up on the stage, and then we will bring you all into the discussion very quickly thereafter. Copies of the survey, I hope you've managed to get one. I think, Robbie, this is a very cool cover that Robbie's folks put together. Let me just, first I'll introduce Robbie, who will do his usual brilliant PowerPoint. I have gotten addicted to Robbie's PowerPoints during our collaboration. And then I'll introduce our panelists briefly. You have longer bios of them. There were some out on the table. Robbie Jones is the CEO of PRRI. He's a leading scholar and commentator on religion, values, and public life. He is the author of two important books, numerous peer-reviewed articles on religion and public policy. He writes a weekly Figuring Faith column at the Washington Post on faith section, so we're double colleagues. He holds a PhD in religion from Emory University and a Master's of Divinity from Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary. And so here for a mathematically rigorous theological talk, I give you Robbie Jones.
Great. Well, first I want to thank Brookings Institution, particularly E.J. Dion and Bill Galston, for what has now been a multi-year, fruitful, ongoing research relationship, and for their gracious hosting of this release event today. And I also want to thank Henry and Brink and Bill, who will also be commenting here, and Carlin Bowman as well, who you will hear from shortly. But my job is to give you the 30,000-foot flyover of the data. You have in front of you reports that kind of lay this out a little more in depth, but I will hit the highlights and hopefully set the table pretty well. I think EJ has given us pretty much the rationale for why we did the survey now. I'm going to tell you just a little bit about what you're looking at. So it was a survey designed and conducted by PRRI. It was a survey of 2,317 American adults conducted online in English and in Spanish. The margin of error is plus or minus 2.5 percentage points for the total sample, and would be remiss without saying a great thank you to the Ford Foundation and to the Nathan Cummings Foundation who made this survey and this partnership possible. So where are we? In search of libertarians. How do we measure libertarians? If you want to go in depth on the scale, and I can say more about it for any of you data heads out there who are interested in how we constructed this thing, we basically built it from a set of 9 questions across 3 subject areas. It's on page 7 of the report if you want to kind of delve into the exact question wording and exactly how the questions were scored. But basically, a set of questions around national security and international intervention, economic policy, and personal liberty and social issues. And answers were scored consistently on one end of the scale for consistent libertarian answers, and answers that were on the other end of the scale were scored low. Answers on the other end of the scale were scored high, and then we constructed a composite scale to map, basically, libertarians in America. This is how it turns out. It turns out that using these 9 questions, you get a fairly normal distribution in the country. You can see a very symmetrical divide here. 7% of the country is what we call consistent libertarians that had more or less consistent answers across all 9 of those questions on the libertarian end of the scale. On the other end of the scale, I'm going to sort of introduce a term that we basically made up, right? Communalist is the term that we put on the other end of the scale. We're going to say not a lot about them right now, but we can come back to them. But basically, just so you know what's on the other end. So if libertarians on this side of the scale, favor low government intervention and high personal liberty, the communalists on the other end of the scale are basically the opposite. They're people who favor high government intervention for certain programs, even if it means, or even if it is at the cost of some personal liberties. So those are the kind of 2 ends of the scales. So we have 7% who are what we call consistent libertarians, another 15% who kind of lean libertarian. They're softer on these measures, but lean libertarian. A majority of the country is somewhere in the middle on this scale, and then very symmetrical numbers on the other end are what we might call communalist. Just to give you a sense of how these break out in terms of party here, on political affiliation, sorry about this. The first one here is the Tea Party. The second one is Republican. The third one is Democrat. I'm not sure what happened to my labels here. So the first one is the Tea Party. You can see certainly higher rates of libertarian. The middle one is Republicans. Again, apologies about the labels missing there. But 26% of the Tea Party are libertarian by our scale. Another 30% lean libertarian. You can see Republicans are considerably lower. Only 12% are libertarian by the scale, a quarter lean libertarian. And this is Democrats over here on the third one. You can see only 1% libertarian, with another 8% leaning libertarian. One of the striking things, if you look at the second and the third scales here, again, the second one is Republicans, the third one is Democrats, is how sort of symmetrical they look, right? So if you look at Democrats, 13% communalists, while Republicans are 12% libertarian. And you can sort of see they're a mirror image of each other, basically, across this scale. So if we look inside of the group of libertarians, what do they look like? Well, first of all, they're overwhelmingly white. So white and non-Hispanic. So here's the general population in yellow, libertarians in orange. 94% of libertarians are white, non-Hispanic Americans. They're also overwhelmingly male. 2/3 are male compared to about half of the country. They also are more likely to be young than the general population. So 62% are under the age of 50 here compared to just 53% of the country. So that's race, gender, and age. What about religious affiliation? Here, also, very interesting, I pulled out these 2 big wedges a little bit to take a look at them. One that immediately stands out are the unaffiliated. Much more likely than other conservative groups to be religiously unaffiliated. Also, 27% mainline. So between these 2 groups, mainline Protestants and unaffiliated, we have a majority of libertarians, so 54%, just between these 2 groups. In the country. The one group that stands out, this green wedge at the bottom, 11%, libertarians about half as likely to be Catholic as the country, as another kind of interesting finding. So overwhelmingly unaffiliated and white mainline Protestant in terms of religious breakdown. And just to give you a comparison here, so this is the same numbers across the top that were in the pie chart, but on the Tea Party, you can see some differences here. For example, on the Tea Party, more than 1/3 of the Tea Party are white evangelical Protestants compared to only 23% there. And then the other big difference you'll see is on the unaffiliated. and among white mainline Protestants, 27 to 19, and then the unaffiliated, really big differences, 3 times as likely, the libertarians 3 times as likely to be religiously unaffiliated compared to those in the Tea Party. Also, you can see, basically this is predictable by now, but if we look at these 3 groups in the kind of selected conservative constituencies, libertarians, the Tea Party, white evangelicals, across a range of religious measures, begin to see a fairly consistent pattern. So here are white evangelical Protestants, 90% believe in God, 44% say religion is the most important thing in their life. And I'm going to put up the Tea Party next. You'll see a little lower measures kind of across the board here, but still fairly high. 3/4 believe in God, and majority say it's necessary to believe in God to be moral. About half attend services weekly or more. And the next slide is the group of libertarians here, and you'll see slightly less on pretty much every measure here. 6 in 10 believe in God, but only 22%, half as likely to attend religious services weekly or more, consistent with the higher rates of being unaffiliated, significantly less likely to be a biblical literalist, and about half as likely to say that religion is the most important thing in their life. So this kind of less religious profile, generally speaking, certainly compared to the Tea Party or white evangelicals. Here are the all-American numbers just for a reference point. You can see also that libertarians slightly lower than even the all-Americans in the country across most of these measures. In terms of political affiliation, here libertarians do have an interesting profile. About half, a little less than half, 45%, identify as Republican. A fairly large chunk identify as independent, but another 15% positively identify with a third party, including 8% who identify with the Libertarian Party itself, and only 5% identify as Democrats. So one takeaway here, right, clearly much more likely to be a Republican constituency than a Democratic constituency here. Looking back, just one way of kind of mapping this onto the election, 80% of those who are Libertarian voted for Romney, but interestingly, 14% voted for a third-party candidate in the last presidential election. So that's consistent with this 15% who actually identify with a third party when you ask about party affiliation as well. Okay, so I'm going to take a little bit of now kind of giving you a profile. The next thing I want to do is to look at the overlap or the relationships between these groups kind of in the conservative coalition. First one is about size. So libertarians make up about 12%, or they make up 12% of Republicans. That makes them a little smaller than the Tea Party, smaller than those who identify with the religious right or conservative Christian movement, and also smaller than those who identify as white evangelical Protestants. But still a significant constituency, 12%, so a little more than 1 in 10 of Republicans identifying are considered classified as libertarians. If we start to look at the overlap here, I'm going to kind of go through these slower so we can make sure we understand them well. So this is among libertarians. The way to read this, among libertarians, how many identify with the Tea Party movement? How many identify with the Christian right? 39% identify with the Tea Party movement, but 61% do not. And this is kind of one of the big takeaways of the report, is finding that 6 in 10 libertarians do not identify with the Tea Party. Also, very few identify with the Christian right. Only 22% identify with the Christian right, 78% do not. Now, if we look at among the Tea Party, kind of a similar set of slides. So this is among the Tea Party. How many identify as libertarian? 26% identify as libertarian, 3/4 do not. And this number is interesting, though. 52% identify with the Christian right. This is actually pretty consistent with the polling that we've done between 2010 and now. In 2010, we found 47% of those who identify with the Tea Party also identified as part of the Christian right. This number is right in line with that number, so about half of those who identify with the Tea Party also identify with the Christian right. Another way of looking at this is that among those who are in the Tea Party, they're about twice as likely to identify with the Christian right as they are to identify with the Tea Party. Is one other way of kind of looking at this. Now, you can thank this next slide, you can thank EJ and Bill for, who are always pushing us to kind of put all this together in one big relationship Venn diagram graph. We did this in 2010. So this is basically what the overlap looks like, put 3 ways between libertarians, the Christian right, and the Tea Party. And you can see like this big chunk of the libertarian circle outside of both of those circles, right? That's sort of one of the big takeaways here. And you can see the Tea Party, this kind of bigger overlap between the Tea Party and the Christian right. So I'm going to put some numbers up here, help you read this. So if you read, among libertarians, 39% of them are part of the Tea Party, consider themselves part of the Tea Party movement. If we go across the Christian right, that little sliver in the middle is 22% of libertarians consider themselves part of the Christian right. If we read it back the other way, among Tea Party members, 26% of them, so about a quarter, consider themselves libertarian. And if we read the Tea Party one back the other way, half, 52% of the Tea Party consider themselves part of the Christian right. So that's the kind of relationship we've got going between these two things, and I think is one of the big takeaways of the survey is just sorting out what the relationship is between these three groups. So I'm going to wrap it up by walking through a set of issues that kind of will paint the picture in terms of economic issues and social issues. The big picture here really is that on economic issues, there is certainly some daylight between libertarians and the Tea Party and white evangelicals, but it is mostly a matter of intensity, with libertarians being a little more intensely opposed to government intervention programs in economics. On the social issues, though, there are quite striking differences between these groups. So we're going to walk you through first some economic issues. So healthcare. You can see here, this is one of those 7-point scale questions. Individuals, on the one end, individuals should take responsibility to pay for their own health insurance. That's the orange I'm showing here. On the other end is the federal government should guarantee health insurance for all citizens, even if it means raising taxes on individuals and businesses. As you can see here, a majority of the Tea Party, certainly on this end of the scale, it says individuals should take responsibility to pay for their own health insurance, but 7 in 10 libertarians are there. Evangelicals have a much more mixed attitude on this particular question. So you can see some real daylight here with Tea Party and libertarians on the same side, but the intensity levels are certainly different. Here's the rest of the 7-point scale mapped out, where you can sort of still see the intensity levels quite differently. On just a couple of other example issues, environmental laws and minimum wage increase. First of all, we look at favor or oppose tougher laws and regulations to protect the environment, even if it raises prices or costs jobs. You can see both libertarians and members of the Tea Party, only a quarter favor tougher environmental laws. White evangelicals stick out for a little higher support, but still only around a third. All Americans, 52% favor. If we look at increasing the minimum wage, you see a similar pattern. All Americans, overwhelmingly, 7 in 10, support increasing the minimum wage from $7.25 to $10 an hour. Only about a third of libertarians favor this. Only 4 in 10 Tea Party members favor this. 6 in 10 white evangelical Protestants favor this. So again, some real differences here. But libertarians and the Tea Party mostly on the same page across these sets of economic issues. But now if we switch to look at some social issues, and here I've got 3, one on abortion, one on physician-assisted suicide, and one on making the use of marijuana legal. So the first one, if we look at, this is the number of those who oppose making it more difficult for a woman to get an abortion. Among all Americans, nearly 6 in 10 oppose making it more difficult for a woman to get an abortion. Libertarians largely in agreement with this question, 57%. But look at this difference here between, you'll start seeing, based on all of these, some real daylight between libertarians and the Tea Party and white evangelicals with this kind of step-down pattern. So that's making it more difficult to get for a woman to get an abortion. The second one is favoring allowing doctors to legally prescribe lethal drugs to help terminally ill patients in their own lives. And here we have all Americans evenly divided on this question. 7 in 10 libertarians in support of physician-assisted suicide. The Tea Party basically divided, and white evangelicals 3 in 10, only 3 in 10 favoring this policy. And then finally, marijuana legalization, fairly similar pattern. We have the country fairly evenly divided, a slim majority favoring the legalization of marijuana, 7 in 10 libertarians favoring it, 4 in 10 libertarians, and only 29% of evangelicals. So here you can really see the space that opens up really on social issues between these constituencies. One that I'm sure we'll talk about some more, where there is actually less space. I want to kind of put this on its own slide so that we can kind of see here, on allowing gay and lesbian couples to marry. All Americans, 52% favor allowing gay and lesbian couples to marry. Here, libertarians are more supportive of this policy than Tea Party members are evangelical, but they still remain majority opposed. Only 4 in 10 favor, 6 in 10 opposed. So this issue plays differently than abortion, marijuana legalization, and physician-assisted suicide. We can maybe talk about why that is a little bit later. I'd be actually interested in the panelists' reflections on that question. And then finally, a little bit about the political context. This is, I think, an interesting slide that goes to why libertarians certainly are important, especially if we're thinking toward 2014, the midterm elections. Libertarians, a majority of libertarians, this is the percent who say they always vote in primary elections, right? So majority, 53%, say they always vote in primary elections. That looks about like those who identify with the Christian right, a little bit about like Republicans. It's a little lower than those who consider themselves part of the Tea Party movement, but higher than all Americans as a whole. So, one takeaway here is this is a group that is engaged and reports that it votes always, a majority report it votes always in primary elections. And then finally, one look ahead at the candidate slate. It's pretty early, but we thought, it'll be fun to kind of see where different constituencies are on the potential, on at least a potential slate of presidential candidates. So here are the numbers for all Republican voters. So this is all among registered voters who identify with or lean toward the Republican Party. They're arranged in ascending order. So you can see Paul Ryan, Chris Christie out ahead, Jeb Bush and Marco Rubio slightly behind, and then a little bit lower support for Rand Paul and Ted Cruz. So that's the kind of among all registered Republicans. But look at the difference between those who are members of the Tea Party, members of the Libertarian, or who are libertarian voters. Rand Paul, far out ahead, right? So not a surprise. This is what you might expect. Ted Cruz, Marco Rubio, not far behind. Jeb Bush, significantly lower. Chris Christie and Paul Ryan also a little bit lower. But Rand Paul, clearly out ahead. And then if you look at the Tea Party group, right? So we see Ted Cruz jumping up here, less support for Rand Paul. Cruz and Rubio getting more of the Tea Party support there. And then finally, among white evangelicals, pretty evenly spread. I guess Paul Ryan a little bit out ahead and Chris Christie, Jeb Bush behind, but really pretty evenly spread. So no clear front runner really among white evangelical voters who lean Republican going through. So let me just kind of wrap it up here. I'm looking forward to the discussion with everyone up here. But I hope that this will provide some nuanced portrait of of a group that we've had really spotty quantitative data for, and will help us kind of think through not only the midterms, but things maybe in closer hand like the upcoming Virginia election, which we will probably talk about. All right, thank you.
As Richard Scarry would say, for those of you who know the kids' books, that was your best PowerPoint ever. That was awesome. I do want to mention the hashtag for people who want to join. It's hashtag ABS2013 for people who want to join the discussion here. Also, this is not necessarily a libertarian thought, but it takes a hardworking community to put together an event and a survey like this. So I do also want to reiterate our thanks to Ford and Cummings. I'd also like to thank the PRRI staff who worked so hard on this, Emily Fetch, Mackenzie Babb, and Joseph Goodman. I'd also like to thank the Brookings staff who worked so hard on this, Amy Goodman, Christine Jacobs, Ross Tilchin, and she always puts her name last on these lists, but she doesn't belong there, Corinne Davis. The first shall be last, if I may offer a religious sentiment here. We have a great all-star panel to respond to this. Representing different parts of it, in some ways, different parts of the spectrum that Robbie just described so well. Carlin Bowman, whom I thank for participating in so many of our events on these surveys, is a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. She compiles and analyzes public opinion on a range of issues. If you want to know American opinion on intervention in Azerbaijan, even though no one is thinking about that. Carlin can probably find you data on it. In addition, she studies the evolution of American politics, paying a lot of attention to demographic and geographical changes. She writes a weekly column for Forbes.com and is a contributor to AEI's Data Points. Brink Lindsey, whom we've been fortunate to have on a number of occasions here at Brookings, is Vice President for Research at the Cato Institute. His current research focuses on economic growth and policy barriers that impede it. In his years at Cato, Brink has served as Director of Regulatory Studies and founder and director of the Center for Trade Policy Studies. He is the senior editor of Regulation magazine, the original editor of Cato Unbound. He is also currently a senior fellow with the Kaufman Foundation. And Brink, they didn't put it on here. Plug your two books, both of which are very interesting. Just mention them now so that...
The Age of Abundance, which is a social history of the United States since World War II and talks a lot about where the libertarian impulse in American politics and culture comes from. And then more recently, Human Capitalism, How Economic Growth Has Made Us Smarter and More Unequal, which focuses on inequality and in particular skills-based inequality.
Thank you. Henry Olsen is a senior fellow at the Ethics and Public Policy Center, where he studies and provides commentary on American politics. I have to say, personally, I found his commentary on the 2012 election particularly enlightening. He did not believe that the polls were all skewed, as I recall. His work focuses on how to address, consistent with conservative principles, the electoral challenges facing modern American conservatism. This work will culminate in a book entitled New Century, New Deal: How Conservatives Can Win Hearts, Minds, and Elections. And finally, my dear colleague Bill Galston is the Ezra Zilka Chair in the Brookings in Brookings' Governance Studies program. He is a senior fellow at Brookings. He's also College Park professor at the University of Maryland. He is the author of many books and articles in the field of political theory, public policy, American politics. He has also done a lot of work in government and politics from 1993 to 1995. He was deputy assistant to President Clinton for domestic policy. So I invite Carlin to kick this conversation off.
Thank you very much, EJ. Last week, the Wall Street Journal ran a story about niche dating sites. There was a picture of a young farmer and his wife who'd met on a site called Farmers Only. But the lead of the piece was about a dating site called Atlasphere, an Ayn Rand appreciating site with a dating component. The 10-year-old site has 16,000 dating profiles, and it saw a spike in its membership after the 2 Atlas Shrugged movies were released. Other straws in the wind that may indicate a nascent libertarian moment are the wonderful libertarian character played by Nick Offerman on Parks and Recreation, and the very positive portrait of Rand Paul and his wife in the new issue of Vogue. Vogue usually runs flattering portraits of Hillary Clinton, but the magazine described in the new issue the era of expectancy around Rand Paul, and its author described him as intriguing and charismatic, an ambassador for libertarian values, something I hadn't expected from Vogue. These cultural touchstones are one reason to take a closer look at libertarians, but there are other reasons that I think are far more important. And here, as usual, PRRI and Robbie's team has its finger on the public pulse. A group of current issues, high levels of mistrust of government, concern about government intrusiveness, wariness of U.S. involvement abroad, and growing social tolerance may be pulling the country in a more libertarian direction. Dissatisfaction with government is at an all-time high in recent polls, including those that were taken before the shutdown antics of the last month. Trust and confidence in government to do the right thing at home and abroad in Gallup's data is the lowest it's been in 40 years. Concern about NSA spying and the Internal Revenue Service investigations are strong. The proportion saying that it's better for the future of the United States to stay out of world affairs is now higher than at any time since that question was first asked in the 1940s. Support for gay marriage seems to be hovering around 50% in most polls today, perhaps plateauing for a time, but that's a significant change from a decade ago. And as we've seen in the pre-election polls in the battleground state of Virginia, support for gay marriage appears to be one of a number of issues propelling Terry McAuliffe's candidacy forward. So this cluster of contemporary issues could pull more people in a libertarian direction. I confess that I started looking for a libertarian moment many years ago when AEI published a little magazine called Public Opinion, and EJ was very involved in that. I found polls from the 1960s asking people about mandatory helmet laws. A significant chunk of Americans who would probably never get on the back of never get on a motorcycle didn't like government telling them what to do. In the early polls on mandatory seatbelts, between 25 and 40% were opposed to requiring them. The requirement or the mandate in the Affordable Care Act to have health insurance is polled more negatively than almost any aspect of the law, and that may explain why 96% of libertarians in PRRI's poll oppose the health care law compared to 54% of the public. Many Americans don't like being told what they can and cannot do by the federal government in Washington. And this is pure conjecture on my part, but the question about gay marriage, which is a little bit different than I think what we might have expected in terms of responses on that question, may stem from people's view that government is imposing this decision or this change on them. Still, the libertarian label doesn't seem to be catching fire. In fairness, we don't have many polls that try to measure the size of the group, and that's one of the many reasons that I think PRRI's new poll is so important. Let me just mention a few of them to put Robbie's findings in comparative perspective. In the Pew Research Center's 2011 typology, they found 9% of the population to be libertarians, what they called, quote, libertarians, free market, small government, and more secular in orientation. In PRRI's newly developed libertarian orientation scale, a similar 7%, as Robbie said, were consistent libertarians, and an additional 15% lean libertarian. In the September Reason-Rupee poll, 8% described themselves as libertarians, again, almost perfectly in line with the PRRI results. And in the polls they've done over the past several years, about 20% lean libertarian based on an analysis of 3 questions that they ask. The libertarian candidate in Virginia is polling at 8%. In all of these polls, libertarians were more likely than others in the population to be white and male. Pew described them as secular. PRRI's survey goes into more detail on religious orientation, but the libertarians in the PRRI poll are less likely than the population as a whole to say that religion is very important in their lives, and as Robbie said, more secular generally in orientation. In most of the polls, libertarians lean to the GOP. In most of these polls, they've had higher levels of formal education. In Pew's cluster analysis, 53% of them were under the age of 50. In PRRI's more recent analysis, as Robbie suggested earlier, slightly more, 62% are. These polls agree broadly that libertarians are opposed to greater government involvement across a whole slew of economic issues, and that they have a distinctive profile that Robbie's described on social issues. Gallup takes a different approach to this issue in its annual governance poll. They ask 2 questions that give us a sense of the size of the libertarian ranks, or what they described in one analysis they did with USA Today as the Keep Government Small constituency. The first question that they ask is, some people think government should promote traditional values in our society. Others think government should not favor any one set of values. With which do you agree more? Last year, for the first time, a majority, 52%, said that government shouldn't favor any set of values. That slipped back to a strong plurality, 48% in their new September 2013 survey. My own analysis of many different polls suggests that people are moving in a more liberal direction on many values questions such as gay marriage and marijuana legalization, even as they continue to say for themselves personally certain behaviors are morally wrong. The new non-judgmentalism probably increases the numbers of those inclined to give libertarians a hearing. Gallup's other question asks whether government is doing too many things that should be left to businesses and individuals, or whether the government should do more to solve our country's problems. In the abstract, in the latest poll, 53% said government was doing too much, and 40% said that government should do more. When Reason-Rupee asked people to tell them in their own words what came to mind when they heard the word libertarian in a February survey, 14% volunteered positive answers, 15% negative ones, but nearly 4 in 10 said that they didn't know enough to say. So many people who might have libertarian beliefs don't identify with the libertarian movement. As PRRI's analysis points out, most people don't have fully consistent sets of beliefs or a clear idea of what ideology means. Still, terms like conservative, liberal, and moderate are generally familiar to most people, and it's a steep uphill climb for people to get people to embrace new labels, whether it's progressive or libertarian. In the September Reason Rupee poll, 30% identified themselves as conservatives when asked about their overall political philosophy, 16% liberal, 22% moderate, 8% libertarian, and 5% progressive. So I think the general comfort level with the more familiar terms and the unfamiliarity with terms such as libertarian and progressive tend to keep those numbers low. But as the cultural indicators I discussed and the current set of public concerns suggest, the political ecosystem may be changing in a direction that's more favorable to libertarians. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I love the idea of a dating site of Ayn Rand readers. They could have a book group where they discuss the virtue of selfishness, one of her books, while talking about love. It would be a really intriguing experiment. Brink Lindsey, bless you for joining us. Thank you.
I'm happy to be the one live specimen of the species under investigation today. Although I should say that one of the favorite games that libertarians like to play is "You're not a real libertarian," and plenty of people would say that about me. But I think I qualify for a Brookings crowd for sure. Just a few observations to put these really interesting results in context. First, it needs to be pointed out that there is no such thing as a libertarian mass movement. There is a libertarian movement of sorts, but it's an intellectual movement confined to a statistically insignificant group of pointy-headed people like me. And so there isn't, though, there is an impulse in American politics, there's a streak in American public opinion, but it's not an organized, articulated, self-conscious force in politics. I would say that that streak has been around since the founding of the Republic, and it continues today. I have no idea what these numbers would look like if you look back historically at different times. I know that the definitions of liberal and conservative change a lot over time, so I'm not sure even what you would pick up from an historical look. I do know one thing that's pretty depressing, which is that it seems like the libertarian streak in American public opinion gets most vibrant and activated in political opposition as opposed to in power. So we didn't see the howls of outrage over socialized medicine when George W. Bush was rolling out Medicare Part D, anything like we have seen over the Affordable Care Act. Likewise, on the left libertarian side of things, the anti-war movement completely disappeared once Barack Obama was elected president. So there is this latent constituency, this impulse in politics. The libertarian worldview that has been articulated by intellectuals is one that sees itself as neither on the left nor the right. But as a matter of sort of sociology and politics, the fact is that libertarianism has been much more closely engaged with the political right than it has been with the left. I think the main reason for that is that the modern libertarian movement arose during the Cold War, when the big political question that it was engaged with was the contest between capitalism and socialism. And so libertarian intellectuals naturally sided with anti-socialists on the right, and so furthermore, the biggest names amongst libertarian intellectuals have been economists who have also been claimed as heroes amongst conservatives, people like Friedrich Hayek and Milton Friedman. So we've seen much more libertarians talking to, engaging with conservatives, writing for conservative outlets, speaking for conservative groups, than you have seen engagement on the left. And so I think one should expect in looking at this libertarian element in American political opinion to see it skewed a bit to the right because of that history of engagement. And we do see that in some of these poll numbers, I think. The gay marriage results were the most surprising to me. I would have expected from movement libertarians overwhelming support for gay marriage, but there is still a current of opinion amongst libertarians that the state shouldn't be involved in marriage at all. And so gay marriage is marriage itself is a discriminatory racket that favors married people over single people. Why extend this injustice to another constituency? Just let people contract for whatever relations they want and leave it at that. So I think that kind of attitude allows some libertarian-leaning folks to not really focus on the current discrimination that's going on and say they've got another answer for it. So maybe that's going on to some extent, or maybe, again, it's just the relative proximity, sociological proximity between libertarian types and conservative types that has skewed those results a bit. Likewise, with abortion numbers, the libertarians were basically in sync with American opinion overall, but I would have expected to see it in sync with liberal public opinion. So here again, I think you have this right skew. Also, there is genuine philosophical disagreement within libertarians. They agree that the state exists to protect persons and property. The question is, who is a person? And libertarian principles don't resolve that issue of when personhood begins. And so there are, I know, in the libertarian movement, certainly pro-life libertarians. And so libertarianism is amenable to a pro-life position more than you might think. But on the ground, most self-identified, self-conscious libertarians I know are overwhelmingly pro-choice. So what are the prospects for this group of people to be organized politically and to have an impact on politics? I would like to see a political movement that is economically conservative, socially liberal, broadly libertarian in outline. We don't have one in American politics right now, and there's no indication on the horizon that we're going to have one. I would chalk that up to the nature of politics and the nature of the contemporary left and right. Henry Adams defined politics as the systematic organization of hatreds. And it's certainly much easier to mobilize people to a political cause when you're angry and ticked off than when you're sort of vaguely satisfied. And the way I told the story in The Age of Abundance, I said that the contemporary right grew up in reaction against the 60s, wishing the 60s had never happened. It's basically the fall of man, and everything's been going to hell since then. And the contemporary left had an equivalent reaction to the 80s and to the revival of small government and lower taxes and deregulation and globalization. And so it has, on its economic policies, organized people who are discontented with the new, more libertarian economic dispensation. As I've said before, you have this curious reactionary entente between liberals and conservatives. They both want to go back to the 50s. The only difference is that liberals want to work there and conservatives want to go home there. But libertarians, at least these inferred libertarians, are people who are basically happy with the dynamism of American economic life and basically happy with the dynamism of American cultural life, but the vaguely satisfied aren't a very tempting constituency to organize. Until something happens to activate outrage in this group of people, as it has to some extent. We're seeing libertarianism talked about a lot more these days because the economy tanked and government has grown dramatically and debt has grown dramatically, and that has gotten the libertarian impulse on the economic side more front and center, at least amongst Republicans, than we had seen it in the past. And likewise, the exhaustion from long unsuccessful wars and fears of a surveillance state, as we've gotten all these new revelations, have brought out the libertarian side on foreign policy and civil liberties issues. So, but here it's really circumstances rather than some organization of this group that are doing the work. And looking forward, I think that there are good reasons for believing that policy is going to move in a more libertarian direction than you might think when you see poll numbers that suggest only 7% of people are genuinely libertarian. And that's because of just the constraint of circumstances. The constraints on the left are that growth, the U.S. economy is slowing down. The only way to speed it back up again is to revive innovation. Reviving innovation means reviving entrepreneurship, which I think means a push towards more pro-market, more pro-competition policies. Deteriorating economic performance, I believe, will be pushing economic policy in a more libertarian direction. Likewise, we've run out of money fiscally, and so we're now in this agonizing, ongoing process of trying to reconcile how much government we want with how much government we want to pay for. I imagine that is going to put a lot of damper on bright, shiny plans to expand government in the future, and will indeed be constraining government in a libertarian way on the fiscal side for years to come. And then on the right, lots of constraints just in terms of the evolution of public opinion as people are growing more socially liberal and more individualistic on a host of issues that have been passionately engaged on the right. They're on the losing side. Likewise, demographically, I think the changes in American population over the coming decades are not going to be favorable for groups who see the American ideal as the sort of white bread Ozzie and Harriet 1950s. So circumstances rather than a political organization of this constituency, I think, are more likely to do the work of pushing us in a libertarian direction. I'll leave it there.
Thank you so much. I think we're all going to remember the 50s. Liberals want to work there and conservatives want to go home there. I was thinking libertarians don't want to have to go home and they want to make investments. But thank you so much. Henry Olsen, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks. I was asked to talk about the effect of the libertarian streak in American politics politically for the conservative movement and for the Republican Party. And that's really two questions that I want to address as part of that. The first is libertarianism or some hard form of it preparing to displace conservatism as the political heart of the conservative movement and of the Republican Party? And then the other question is, does the GOP need to become more libertarian consistently in order to win general elections? I believe the data in this poll, as well as the data in many of the other polls that Carlin has cited, have a pretty clear answer to that, both questions, and it's the same one. No. First, with respect to the future of libertarianism in the short term within the Republican Party, just note what Robbie noted, which is the incredibly small size of the libertarian consistent movement within the Republican Party. 12% of Republican bases are libertarians compared to much larger elements of the other parts of the conservative base. And I might add what's not mentioned here, which is the extremely large non-conservative part of the Republican Party that is actually the silent majority in most Republican electorates. This is exacerbated by the geographic concentration of these groups, that white evangelicals tend to have outsized power within the Republican Party because they're concentrated geographically in the South and the border states, whereas libertarians tend to be dispersed, and where they are more geographically concentrated, they tend to be in areas that are democratically dominated. So that even the small number of libertarianism as a political force, as opposed to an intellectual force, is minimized because of the way that they live, as opposed to the political force of, in particular, white evangelical Protestants. So then you have to ask a question is, well, are there missing libertarians that a harder libertarian stance could bull into the Republican Party? And there you've got the 14% of libertarians who voted for a third-party candidate in 2012 and the 15% that identify in some way with a third party. But, you know, that's 14% of 7%, which is 0.98%, which is curiously close to the 0.99% that Gary Johnson received. And 8% of 7% is 0.56%, which is, again, curiously close to the average of about 0.4% that the LP candidate has received since the election of Ronald Reagan in 1980. So there just aren't many people who matter electorally to be pulled into a Republican Party by moving in a harder libertarian stance. So then you've got the question of, if they can't influence the nomination through sheer numbers and there aren't really ways to add to them by going to the right, what about libertarian leaners? Note that they are 24% of Republicans, so combined that's a 36%. Isn't that a great group to listen to? The problem I've got with that is, as Robbie noted, they have a different ideological profile, which is why he didn't include them. Let's think about going through the appendices, what a libertarian leaner means in Robbie's poll. It means somebody who averaged between a 3 or a 4 on every one of those questions. Now, I've been in the Republican Party for 40 years, and if I went to a group of small business people, I could get a 3 or a 4 out of virtually all of those questions. What I think the libertarian leaner group is the business establishment of the Republican Party. And so consequently, the Republican Party is already very attractive to those people who are generally but not intensely opposed to government expansion, people who are generally but not intensely supportive of personal social liberties, people who are generally but not intensely suspicious of intervention abroad. That is the center of the Republican Party, not a libertarian alliance. Nationally, as long as exit polls have been done in presidential primaries, which is going back to 1992, the Republican Party nationally divides very neatly into 3. Even in 2012, at the height of the Tea Party mania, about 30% of Republicans who turn out in presidential primaries say they are moderate and liberal. About a third say they are very conservative, and the rest say they are somewhat conservative. That group is the only group that always wins. The somewhat conservative person, who I would argue is the person who is a libertarian leaner or somebody with mixed views on the scale, is the center of the Republican Party. And that's why the Republican Party continues to nominate people whom the factions of the extremes, whether the white evangelical faction or the libertarian faction, find distasteful, because they're the majority and the single largest faction in the party. So from a nominating standpoint, libertarianism, despite the enthusiasm of Ron Paul, despite the pyrotechnics of Freedom Works and so forth, is not going to be the political future in the near term for the Republicans. So then the question is that a strategic error? You know, is Republicans just missing the boat? Should they become more libertarian to attract people who are not identifying as libertarians, but would if they only thought Republicans were more open to that? That's a standard argument you hear in libertarian circles. And I would argue that the analysis suggests not. For a couple of reasons. One is the libertarian leaners that we just suggest actually are not people who seem to feel very intensely about much of anything. They have inclinations, but they are not strongly passionate. If there's one thing that defines the libertarian hard movement, it's passion. You take a look at the numbers on intensity. You take a look at, on page 24, the intensity of, or not page, if you look at particularly the intensity on the Obamacare question, 71% of self-described libertarians, or on the right for health care question, said one. Absolutely, it is the right of the individual who should take care of their health care. By definition, the intensity that produces libertarian commitment is itself a bit off-putting to the person in the middle. In 1984, I was had a number of friends who were libertarians in Los Angeles, and they were telling me the story of the then LP candidate for president who was on a morning talk show. And remember, this is 1984, and supposedly the host breathlessly said, "Is it true that libertarians believe that any two adults ought to be able to do whatever they want to in the privacy of their own bedroom?" And Berglund, without missing a beat, says, "Why do you limit it to 2?" So that intensity itself, I think, the thing that would make a libertarian more excited is exactly the thing that would make libertarian leaners a little bit more. Yeah. You may use it. The other thing, though, is you've got the people who think they're libertarian, but they really aren't. And that you can see in this poll from the group that is libertarian self-identified. In the Pew typology, you see that in a group of people who they call postmoderns. And the postmoderns demographically look similar to the libertarians. I wrote about this in National Review in a piece called Rand Paul's Party. And they're young, they're educated, they're wealthy, they're secular, they believe in hard work, they believe in free trade, they are liberal on social issues. They just happen to love President Obama, like Obamacare, think that the UN is a great institution, and have no problem in the government regulating child obesity. They're social democrats, okay? And we see this in the PRRI poll. Take a look at the Libertarian ID on Appendix 3, page 35. You ask the question on social issues, and you see making it more difficult for a woman to get abortion. Well, libertarians and self-identified libertarians are pretty similar on that. Making marijuana legal, it's page 35, pretty similar on that. The government or doctor-assisted euthanasia, pretty similar on that. Then you get to economics. Increase the minimum wage, 28% more likely to say yes for libertarian self-identified. Libertarians don't like the idea. Tougher laws to protect the environment, 26% of libertarians say yes. 52% of self-identified libertarians say yes. At making it more difficult to access pornography on the internet, 31% of libertarians say yes. 58% of self-identified libertarians say yes. Again, there's a group of people who speak some of the language of libertarians, but they do not have the consistent application and the intensity. In Europe, you would call them mild social democrats. Here, you might call them postmoderns, as Pew did. But there's really no viability of the Republican Party to say, as some in the libertarian movement do, just get rid of the Christians and get rid of the social issues and get rid of the warmongering. And all of these people love hard work and they're educated and they'll come. No, they won't, because then you will take that off the table and they will find other disagreements with you. So the future of the GOP is going to be tied not to the ability to stop speaking the language of power, which characterizes the libertarian intensity, and start speaking the language of justice. Not who controls, but what's right. That's where people who hold mixed views exist. They are less concerned with who does it than what is done. And so to that extent, I would argue that the libertarian movement, libertarianism, as opposed to a liberty-fused conservatism, is the apple in the political Garden of Eden. A lot of people and the Republicans may really want to eat it, but it'll get them kicked out if they do.
Thank you so much. I want to ask my colleague, Bill Galston.
Well, in Judaism, apple eating is equated not with original sin, but with opening one's eyes and beginning to understand the world. So perhaps we can have it out. But I'm actually, I want to proceed quickly because I'm eager to see Henry and Brink take their jackets off and really get to it. I've picked out, one subject for more extended treatment. And that is the relationship between liberals and libertarians on social issues and the role that religion plays in that relationship. And let me just put the facts on the table as fast as I can. Consider the question that the survey asked: should we allow doctors to prescribe lethal drugs to help terminally ill patients end their own lives? Libertarians say yes by a margin of 72 to 25. Liberals say yes by an almost identical margin of 70 to 29. If one folds in the religious dimension of this, white evangelicals are overwhelmingly opposed, 29 to 70. Unaffiliated Americans are overwhelmingly in favor, 79 to 20. And what unites liberals and libertarians, it seems to me, is a lower than average propensity to intense religiosity. And that fundamental similarity comes out here. And it reflects an underlying principle. or a choice. Do we own ourselves, or does God own us? If you believe that we own ourselves, then there is no principled argument against physician-assisted suicide. If you believe that we are the servants of God and that the God who created us owns us and only God has the right to terminate life, you come out with a completely different argument, and it tends to a different conclusion. So that's question number one. Here's another question. Should the law make it more difficult to access pornography on the internet? Well, here things get interesting. Libertarians don't think so, not surprisingly. Only 24% favor that course of action, fully 75% are opposed to it. For liberals, it's pretty much the other way around. 61% are in favor of making it more difficult to access pornography on the internet. That's what they say anyway. And only 38 think that we shouldn't do that. Now, what's going on here? I think there are at least two interpretations of the liberal-libertarian split on this question. No doubt the audience can think of others. First of all, libertarians distinguish between harm to self and harm to others. And if what we are doing harms only ourselves, then government shouldn't be in the business of regulating it. If it involves harm to others, then government should be. And it's possible that when liberals look at pornography, they see harm to self or alternatively harm to other people. A standard liberal line is that pornography degrades women, makes women more vulnerable to all sorts of abuse. When libertarians look at pornography, they see at most harm to self, and they probably don't even see that, and they certainly don't see harm to others. That's one interpretation. Here's the other interpretation. There is a fundamental disagreement between liberals and libertarians as to whether government should act when the issue is harm to self and not harm to other people. And there's evidence in this survey to bear out that interpretation as well. So consider the following. The proposition on offer is, it is not government's business to protect people from themselves. And intriguingly, but not surprisingly, 94% of libertarians endorse that proposition. Only 22% of liberals do. Liberals are, in this sense, paternalists. They believe that part of the state's business is to protect people from harming themselves. This is a fundamental disagreement. And not entirely by chance, only 22% of Democrats endorse the proposition that it's not government's business to protect people from themselves. Who are the paternalists? I've been able to find three groups. First of all, Americans with postgraduate degrees. Second, African Americans. And third, Hispanics. It is the ethnic and racial communities with the most direct and pervasive experience of people acting in ways that harm themselves who are most likely to endorse the proposition that government ought to intervene to prevent them from doing it. And I suspect if you looked at attitudes on drug use, among other issues, you'd find ample confirmation of that proposition. Now, let's take a look, and this will be my concluding point, on the interesting relationship between libertarians and liberals on the question of religion and the role of religion in our lives and what religion is anyway, what it amounts to. As we've already seen more than once, liberals and libertarians are, of all the groups surveyed, the most disproportionately likely to be religiously unaffiliated. And many people who are religiously unaffiliated are unbelievers or disbelievers of one sort or another. That doesn't mean they're all Richard Dawkins, but some are. What about religious, what about more precise forms of religious behavior? If you ask what share of the general population attends religious services seldom or never, 43% of the general population, but 55% of libertarians and 60% of liberals. If you ask about belief that the Holy Book is the Word of God in the general population, 58%. Among liberals, 31%. Libertarians, 43%. Here's a really interesting one. Religion is not important at all, or certainly not as important as other things. For the general population, you only get 34% endorsing either of those propositions. For liberals, it's 57%. Religion is not important or not as important as the other things in my life, and libertarians aren't far behind with 46%. Or, what about the proposition that it's necessary to believe in God in order to be moral and have good values? The population is split down the middle on that point, but only 31% of liberals and 36% of libertarians think that to be moral and to have good values, you need to believe in God. So far, liberals and libertarians are walking down the road of non-religion together. But then, a separation, and this will be my concluding point. Based on the results of this survey, libertarians appear to be more open to religion than do liberals, even when the libertarians themselves are not among the faithful. So consider the following three questions. Religion causes more problems in society than it solves. Liberals endorse that proposition, 54 to 45. Libertarians reject it, 37 to 62. Or what about the proposition that was litigated all the way up to the Supreme Court, that the two words under God in the Pledge of Allegiance violate separation of church and state? More than 4 in 10 liberals endorse that proposition. Only 15% of libertarians do. Here's a particularly intriguing one. It is important for children to be brought up in a religion so that they can learn good values. 67% of the overall population endorses that proposition. Only 44% of liberals do, but 65% of libertarians endorse the proposition, essentially identical with the general population. What's going on here? Well, here's my sociological answer. Libertarians, regardless of what they now believe, tend to come from families that were more religiously believing and observant than do liberals. If you look at questions such as praying once a week or more at family meals, attending religious education once a week or more, or attending religious services once a week or more with your family, on all of those questions, libertarians are much more likely to provide an affirmative answer than liberals are. So oddly, libertarians, although about as unreligious as liberals, appear to be more open to the claims of religion, dare I say, more tolerant of it.
Thank you so much, Bill. It sounds like what you're saying is that libertarians lost faith and liberals never had it. By the way, the instant availability of data, Robbie and I here were intrigued by your finding on pornography and liberals. And we discovered in the process of doing some very quick data analysis that on the question, make it more difficult to access pornography on the internet, 27% of men strongly favored this view, 49% of women strongly favored this view. There's an enormous gender gap. And if you look at overall agreement, 57% of men, but 73% of women. And I'm curious if that inflects some of the ideological answer as well. This is a great panel. I do want to see the brawl between Brink and Henry, not because I like to divide the right, but just because I think it would be intellectually fascinating. But I do want to ask maybe kick that off by asking Robbie a couple of questions that I think were raised by the discussion already, and also want you to reply or comment on what you have heard. But I was intrigued by this, the distinction between libertarians and libertarian leaners, and I'm wondering if you can enlighten us on that. And then I am also intrigued by the communalists, and while the focus of this survey, this report today is not on the communalists, they really seem, I don't know which bad metaphor to use, libertarians turned on their heads. I mean, they seem, or the exact opposite of the libertarian constituency in so many ways. So if you could sort of talk about those leaners and talk a little bit about the communalists, and then I'd like to invite Brink and Henry to a little bit of argument.
Great. Yeah. Well, let me talk a little bit about the leaners. We, whenever we create a scale, one of the things we do is try to figure out where the right cut points are on the scale and who is in which category. And one of the things that we, so we were kind of playing around with this and looking at the dividing points. And basically what we found is that there actually is quite big gaps, as Henry pointed out, between libertarians, who we call consistent libertarians, and these libertarian leaners. So you can see it, for example, on questions of vote. 22% of libertarian leaners voted for Barack Obama, only 5% of consistent libertarians voted for Barack Obama. You can see it in the third-party vote, 14% libertarians, only 6% of libertarian leaners in that third-party category. You can also see it on a range of issues, both economic and social. So it's not just the social issues where you see the gap. So like on the minimum wage question, for example, as we said, 2/3, 65% of libertarians oppose increasing the minimum wage from $7.25 to $10 an hour. When you look at that libertarian leaner group, it's only 39% oppose raising the minimum wage. So you clearly see, even though that's sort of lower than the general population, it looks about like Republicans overall, rather than looking like a group that's sort of more libertarian leaning on that. And then just one more example in here that I think will make the point. On the abortion question, where we had 57% of libertarians in that consistent libertarian category oppose making it more difficult for a woman to get an abortion, that is about what the general population is. When you look at that libertarian leaners group, they're evenly divided on that question, right? So different, very different than the libertarian. So we do have actually a different group in that libertarian leaners group, where on some questions they look, and I think your characterization actually as kind of the business establishment is maybe not far off on that. That seems about right. They look like Republicans overall on a number of these issues. And then the other question you wanted me to address?
Just tell us a bit about the communalists.
Yeah, so the communalists, I mean, we didn't do a lot of analysis here, but stay tuned, right? We have a whole set of stuff here to cut our teeth on, and it is a really interesting group. Not surprisingly, it is much more racially diverse. So whereas this was on the libertarian end, we're more than 9 in 10 white, non-Hispanic. We have a high number of African Americans. It's also older, interestingly enough. The communalist group, it's a little more Catholic than the libertarian end of the scale. In terms of vote, it is a high Obama constituency, so more than 8 in 10. What we might call consistent libertarians voting for Obama, communalists voting for President Obama, 13% for Mitt Romney. So it is in some ways sort of turned on its head, but again, it's not quite the kind of straight left-right constituency either. And give me a minute, I'll come up with some other examples on like a couple of these issues that I think will tell it, but I'll come back to it while we're...
Speaking personally, as a Catholic, would be very disappointed if there weren't a lot of Catholic communalists. But Brink, why don't you, I'd like you basically to reply to Henry in terms of the future.
I will reject your characterization of any disagreement between Harry and me as an intra-right disagreement, because as I said at the outset, the best conception of libertarianism is not of it as being on the right, and certainly I myself do not consider myself on the right, but perhaps dissension on the non-left, we can put it that way. And I don't think I have fundamental disagreements with Henry. I strive to avoid the kind of wishful thinking that the blogger Matt Iglesias has named the pundits fallacy, which is that the best way for politicians to win is to adopt the policy ideas that I think are substantively best. So this conflation of good ideas with popular ideas is something that's a great temptation for Washington pundits and almost always leads them into error. So I don't want to assert that the Republican Party would profit handsomely by a huge turn in a radical libertarian direction, because I know many of the views that I have are not popular or at the very least are not so attractive as to be the basis of a winning political campaign. Nonetheless, I would say that even if it's not terribly realistic to think that the Republicans are going to win by amping up their libertarianism to 11, I do think that you can say that libertarians can get in trouble when they veer too much away from the libertarian traditions on economics, and also if they deviate too far in military adventurism. So that is, they can alienate libertarian and libertarian-leaning Republicans that usually vote for them. So we see in the results published today an overwhelming identification with Republicans relative to Democrats amongst libertarians. So there's no way that libertarians are part of the Democratic base, but they are not a reliable part of the Republican base either. And I think you can see that more clearly if you look at not just at this current snapshot, but you look at things over time. Here I'm going to lean on some studies that were done. One of the co-authors is in the audience by David Kirby and my colleague at Cato, David Bose. One's called The Libertarian Vote, and the other is called The Libertarian Vote in the Age of Obama. They're two studies published by the Cato Institute. I think one was in 2006, the other was in 2010. But they did a similar exercise of inferring a libertarian constituency from polling data and then examined how that constituency voted in different elections. And the general rule was for libertarians to vote for Republican presidential candidates or Republican candidates for Congress around 70-30, but it didn't always hold that way. So on the presidential side, so in 1988, it was 74-26 for the Republican. But in 1992, it was 35 for the Republican, 33 for Perot, 32 for Clinton. So a big move away from George H.W. Bush, who was not at all popular amongst small government conservatives and libertarian-leaning conservatives. Likewise, libertarians went big for George W. Bush in 2000, 72-20, but by 2004, that support had retreated to 59-38. For House candidates, Senate looks the same. In 2000, 2002, it was 73-23, 70-23. But then 2004, 2006, as the Iraq War dragged on, as spending was going through the roof, et cetera, now it was Republicans 53-44, 54-46. So those are big 20-point swings away from the Republican, and here this group was something in the 15% of the electorate. So 20% of 15% is 3%. That often is the margin of a presidential election. So I would say that this is not an irrelevant constituency. It's not so tucked into the base that it's so inframarginal that nobody will ever court it. On the contrary, the fact that it is not a reliable part of the Republican base means that there are incentives, if not to actively court it, at least not to push it away.
And Henry, what I wanted to ask you is, A, to reply to that, but B, at times from your presentation, I can't quite tell whether your warning to Republicans is don't move too far away from social conservatism or you'll blow up a big piece of your constituency, or you need to embrace a bit more government interventionism on behalf of the less well-off, or you're never going to win an election. Maybe you're saying both things at the same time, but I'm trying to, if you could tease that out and with reference to some of this data.
Let me just quickly respond to Brink, which, again, I don't think we have a lot to disagree with about. The The one thing I would say is I've read the Boas and Kirby reports, and I think what you note at the end is that what they come up with is a 15% libertarian share, which is significantly larger. The reason they do that is because they base their characterization on the answers to either, I think in one year they did 2 or 3 questions and the other 3 or 4, but they were very broad, general, theoretical questions that didn't get into the practical applications of them. So I think if somebody basically said that, David shaking, they were the sort of questions that you would understand why a libertarian would answer all of them, but they were at the theoretical level. And I think what happened there is because they were at that theoretical level, you attracted the sort of libertarian leaner who in fact is very different from the hardcore libertarian. So again, when we use the term, what I was trying to say was not don't talk about liberty. No, that would be stupid. What I was trying to say was there's a particular consistency and intensity that characterize the person who is a full-throated, consistent libertarian. That the libertarian leaner, or in this case, part of that 15%, do not share that. So to say that, as here in Washington, most of the people who argue that they're libertarians are in fact consistent libertarians, and they are, although you're not, many of the people who share your background are saying, be more like me. What I'm trying to say is that won't win you votes. There may be policy reasons, but if you're doing it for political reasons, the people who are libertarian sympathizers are in fact substantively different than libertarians, and that means that you need to think about how to talk to each group separately as opposed to thinking that they all lump together in like some big untouched pool that we were of voters that we were never aware of before. To answer your question, EJ, I do a lot of writing and I'll be fleshing this out more. What I think the Republican Party will need to do to win national elections is to have a understanding that it is not theoretically inappropriate to be where you're going to end up practically, which is say no Republican candidate actually runs on a platform, not even Rand Paul, that would substantially dismantle in a short period of time the advances of the New Deal and the Great Society. They may fundamentally transform the nature of those programs, but they will not if a Republican says, I'm against redistribution, no Republican runs on a program that is consistently against redistribution. School vouchers is redistributionist. Premium support in Medicare is redistributionist. Social Security private accounts is, depending how you define it, in some way redistributionist. Again, that would depend on whether it's a topped-off private account or a blended 2% plus Bush's thing of 2% into private accounts plus another smaller benefit is in fact just a smaller form of redistribution. So if the Republican conservative movement is in fact going to be talking about a government one of the things I said at Heritage to amplify this is that if you take the Paul Ryan Heritage Foundation budget, they differ with about 1% of GDP. I think Heritage was at 18 and Ryan was at 19. And you take government the size of Texas, that virtually everybody in the conservative movement would stand up and say, yeah, I want my government to be the size of Texas. That gives you a government of 27% of GDP. Because Texas's state GDP share is about 8 or 9%, and 18% at the federal level. That's big government. It's lots of redistribution going on. So if that's where the right is, perhaps we should think of a theory that actually lets us govern that 27% and in a way that lets people know that we have their interests at heart and that we're not really that we're not really uninterested in the thing that we purport to be reforming.
Bless you. I want to bring in Bill Galston, who has a comment. I've got to excuse myself for just a second. Robbie will take over. I'll be right back.
Well, Henry almost buried the lead, but not quite. So let me put it back on the table because I just think it's an extraordinarily interesting proposition. I think we all know how the Pledge of Allegiance ends, with liberty and justice for all. And I take Henry to be arguing, and I'm just going to restate what he said, that the right has spent too much time talking about liberty and too little time talking about justice. And the idea of a theory of one's actual practice, if one's actual practice is incontestably redistributionist, is the cashing out of that general proposition. So here is my question, and I think it is a question to Henry. Okay, if Republicans ought to be talking less about liberty, or the right ought to be talking less about liberty and more about justice, then what is the right's theory of justice, or what should it be in your view, and how does that theory differ from the left's?
Well, first I'll refer you to my book when it comes out.
Yeah, that's,
But I was at the Reagan Library over the weekend, and so what I realized was that while I was sobbing away watching the beautiful California sunset 9 years ago as his casket was being left, that I was actually at the Reagan Library. So I got to visit that site, and I took a picture of his epitaph, and I'm trying to read it here. And it says, "I know in my heart that man is good, and that what is right will always eventually triumph, and there is value and worth in each and every life." Okay, that's Ronald Reagan's final words to all of us. And what I would say is that that's a conservative theory. That is a conservative argument. And if you look at the words and actions of Ronald Reagan from the minute he stands up on the stage in 1964 to the minute he died, he was somebody who talked about that. And the things I say is that if you look at the 64 speech of Goldwater that made him a conservative hero, he endorsed the expansion of health insurance through federal power for poor seniors. He said he opposed what would become Medicare because it was a one-size-fits-all program, but he was for a federal program to make sure that anyone who was old and couldn't afford it would be able to afford health insurance. Now, what comes out when you read Reagan is that there's a theory of desert and effort and liberty that combines together into what would be recognized as more of a non-socialist, soft welfare state, as opposed to the top-down regulatory command and control Wilsonian in America or social democratically inspired approach in Europe. That is distinctly a different philosophy. It is one that enhances it believes that the producer has innate value and that consequently confiscatory tax rates and regulations that seem to be punitive rather than dealing with some legitimate public problem hurts that person's value. And that also turning to the side and saying that we have no responsibility to collectively help somebody who can genuinely help themselves but has fallen on hard times is also not treating that person with appropriate value. It is something that combines different conservative intellectual strands, but it's something I think is uniquely American that would actually give clear policy direction to the different strands of the Republican Party.
Thank you. Robbie wants to add a point. I want to repeat, by the way, that the hashtag is hashtag AVSAV for Victor, or American Values Survey is what it is, AVS 2013. There are some questions that have come in. I'm going to ask questions that come in that way. But Robbie wanted to make a point, and then I'm going to go to the audience.
Just want to make one point that came up about the scale. I just want to make sure this is clear from the appendix if you want to dive into it. But one thing that we deliberately chose to do when creating the scale and hence the definition of what counted as a libertarian is that we did not include measures of abortion or same-sex marriage in the scale itself, right? And one of the reasons why we chose not to do that is because this has become so partisan and so polarized in the current debate that we wanted to let those issues fall where they would. Using the scale. So that's one of the reasons why I think they may be skating a little differently than we see, but I think it's also a window into how the left-right movement skews, right, what might be a consistent libertarian worldview. There's a gravitational pull, I think, that our conservative to liberal politics plays, even on, a libertarian constituency or impulse. I love that word, impulse. That's in many ways swimming against the current, right, of this kind of left-right pull. And then the only other thing, just to flesh out, and then want to get some questions in. On the communalist, it mentioned sort of that they're more ethnically diverse, but the two religious groups that make up a majority of communalists are Catholics and African-American Protestants, right? So that's kind of the vision among communalists. Versus white mainline Protestants and the unaffiliated anchoring the libertarians. And then finally, just they're older. And the other thing is just gender is playing a huge role here, right? 61% of communalists are female, right? 2/3 of libertarians are male. So there's a huge gender divide running right through all the dynamics that we're talking about here today.
I told Robbie I was grateful for his survey because it confirmed something I had been telling my libertarian friends for many years, which is libertarianism was the perfect ideology for a reasonably well-off white male in his 20s. And there's quite a bit of support for that view in the data. Let's go to the gentleman in the back right there. You're just the first hand I saw. Again, hashtag AVS2013 for those of you out there in Twitter land.
Hi, Hugh Grindstaff. Does the libertarian view I noticed on the use of military force is limited? The communalist, a little bit more expanded. But did you survey the thought of military service by the libertarians? Thank you.
No, we don't have a question on military service. And we were actually talking about this beforehand, and one of the things we see in the data is that there's not much appetite in the American public overall for a kind of large interventionist, footprint, and we're sort of seeing the public opinion skew generally that direction. But unfortunately, military service would have been a really interesting one to ask about, but we don't have a question about it.
The lady in the right there, please. Yes, you.
Hi, Kathy Grossman from Religion News Service.
Yes, welcome.
Thank you. The question about the sort of outlying position on gay marriage. It was proposed that perhaps this is because it's not about the gays, it's about the government. They don't think the government should be legalizing marriage of any sort. But does the gender gap also explain this? I don't know overall what the male-female breakdown is in society about gay marriage.
I'm going to pass that to Brink while Robbie looks up that breakdown. Just by the way, one of our tweeters, Michelle Diggles of Third Way, had a question along these lines. She wrote, I don't understand how libertarians can square their political views with opposition to marriage for gay couples. So it's, if you could deal with both those questions.
So I got the gender split in the general population on allowing gay and lesbian couples to marry is men are basically divided on the question, 48 to 47. 48 support, favor. Women are 55 in favor and 41 opposed.
So
yeah,
women more pro?
Yes.
That's been consistent historically.
Right, and we see that actually in age groups too, even among millennials that are 18 to 30, 29-year-olds who are overwhelmingly in favor. There is still a gender gap even among millennials on this question. That's maybe playing some role here as well. So we got young men in this group, but there's still a gender gap even among the youngest Americans on this question.
Yeah, so I think that's probably a big part of this, is that it's not the right skew, it's the male skew of the libertarian group being asked the question about gay marriage. But again, just to play this out a little bit more, there are people doing libertarian stuff on the left all the time, people pushing for drug legalization in Colorado and Washington, people fighting against the building of a wall on the Mexican border and fighting for freer entry of people into our country, people who were up in arms about military adventurism in the last decade, but they never call it libertarian. So they just say they're being liberal or progressive. The time the word libertarian is used is when conservatives are doing libertarian things, or at least talking about libertarian things. And so to the extent that word is entered into vocabulary, it's got a right of center valence, and I think that therefore people who sort of come under the sway of that impulse are probably skewed to the right these days because there's more appetite for that term on the right than there is on the left.
This gentleman, why don't we do sort of a couple, this gentleman right here in the aisle, and then the gentleman back there, and this gentleman here.
Hi, I'm Fred Altman. I wonder what economic data you have. In the Post this morning, it indicated that a lot of the support for the Tea Party and related activities comes from areas of the country that are more economically distressed than the rest. And I wonder how much of your data would be interpreted in terms of the economics of the respondents.
Thank you. I read that story a little differently. I'm not sure they said it comes from areas where there's economic distress, but rather a lot of people in those areas who are Tea Party explain the distress in terms of Obama. Although I think it is, because I think the red states, I'm trying to remember, are the red states doing better or worse than the blue states? And on balance, I think the blue states tend to be better off, but I'm not sure they're better off in this recession. So there may be truth to it accidentally, but anyway, I will. Robbie can pick up on that question.
Well, one of the more interesting things I think from the survey is that we did not see huge regional differences. So there weren't great, in the West, there weren't great, libertarian concentrations in the West. They looked at pretty evenly distributed, as Henry mentioned, sort of, evenly distributed across, so not heavily concentrated in the South.
Tea Partiers are more southern.
In the South, yeah. But libertarians much more evenly spread out across the country. That goes for urban-rural divides too. We looked at those as well, and not huge differences urban-rural either.
The gentleman right there next to you. Yeah, thank you.
Hello, I'm Mark Brodsky, retired physicist and CEO. Lindsey mentioned an intriguing word when he was talking about rules about marriage by government or God or otherwise. And he mentioned contracts. And libertarians believe in letting it just be a contract. My question is, how do contracts fit into libertarianism in the sense of who enforces them?
Thank you. A classic question.
Yes. So the libertarian view is that that's the state's job. The state's job is to protect private property, protect persons from bodily harm, and to enforce contracts. There is then the group that says, you're sellouts, you're wimps, and that's the anarcho-capitalist group who thinks that contract enforcement and justice provision can be done by private agencies as well. Again, from my own perspective, I think that the legal status of marriage is so deeply ingrained in our society, and there are so many implications to that status that's the question we have to deal with today, is that status being made available to people on a discriminatory or a non-discriminatory basis, and I'm for it being made available on a non-discriminatory basis. But again, there are libertarians who object to the whole idea of the state involvement in marriage and would like to see it just handled on a purely sort of ad hoc basis, that whatever couples or groups of people who want to bind themselves in some sort of long-term legal relationship, they ought to be able to do it as they wish.
This gentleman, thank you.
Doug Weber. In looking at these numbers here, recognizing that 73% of the conservatives, 61% of liberals, and 65% of all Americans, plus 58% of libertarians would like to see pornography access curtailed. I'm wondering, do you see any possibility of having a UK-type opt-in, opt-out policy? Or since the majority of members are male in Congress, does that throw it out?
Who's going to take that? I don't know. Somebody explain the question. I'm naive about pornography, I guess. The opt-in, opt-out. I'm sorry?
Yeah, David Cameron has brought something that rather than having pornography automatically accessible, you will actually have to opt in in order for it to be accessible, which is different from simply curtailing it from the national level.
That sounds politically very shrewd to me, but I don't know if there are any views on this.
I've not heard anything about someone proposing this for the United States. I imagine it would meet a buzzsaw of opposition from a whole bunch of different fronts. So in general, I think people tell pollsters stuff about sex that makes them feel good about themselves, and maybe it's not exactly what they're going to think when changes in laws are being discussed. But at any rate, I would think that here's an area where the libertarian streak in American politics is going to probably carry the day.
The great line during Prohibition is they pray for Prohibition and then they vote for beer. And there's a lot of that going on. This lady way in the back has had her hand up for a while. Yes, ma'am. There's a mic for you.
My name's Mariam Sharon Mohammed. I am a Howard University PhD and an Arabic language fellow, returned Peace Corps volunteer from Uzbekistan. And my question is, for those of us who are tied for C. Public Howell, a libertarian concern, if we get sued CDT4, what does the party now recommend?
I'm sorry, I didn't understand the question. If you get sued, what?
For those of us who come in and take a look at big government for the U.S. Catholic Church's hell, if we get sued a CDT4, what does the Libertarian Party recommend?
Okay, I have nothing to do with the Libertarian Party, and I don't know what CDT4 means.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Right there, the gentleman right over there, yeah, with the glasses. Just your hand shot up so fast that, yeah, right. Yes, the glasses behind. Yeah, there are a lot of glasses around. I'm a gentleman with glasses.
For the question regarding the tougher laws and regulations to protect the environment, 73% of libertarians oppose that, and 75% of liberals do support it, almost an exact opposite. But climate change, by definition, would be harmful to others, something that libertarians would usually come in on the side of the state to protect. Is it such a partisan issue as far as left-right goes because of that, or does it have to do with the fact that, like, Al Gore, the guy who propagated the whole idea, was a liberal himself? That's been argued. What is the libertarian view on curbing climate change?
Asking what is the libertarian view on anything is never the right question. Put 10 libertarians in a room and you'll have 13 different versions of libertarianism at each other's throats. So in general, libertarians are suspicious of the need for expansive new regulatory regimes and taxes, and therefore are sympathetic to readings of climate science, which find that there isn't a need for such dramatic action in the here and now. Likewise, people who are generally cool with the need for government to keep things in line, may be much more likely to see to think that climate science is offering a reason for big government involvement. So I think basically out there in the public, people have their ideology first, and their science follows from that. But even if one accepts, and I have no reason to contest the scientific consensus that there's anthropogenic global warming, I still think that the proposed means for doing anything about it in the United States have a lot of problems. So in particular, we had the whole carbon emissions trading scheme, which looked like a real Rube Goldberg device that was going to be shot through with exceptions, that was going to be a lot of actually favoring particular industries and disfavoring others without having really any discernible impact on global climate because it's just affecting the U.S. economy. So I think you don't have to get to the scientific questions to have a policy view on these questions. I'll just say that.
By the way, just on this ideological question of the loading of libertarian that you mentioned, in this survey, what's so interesting is libertarians kind of look like America. 32% of self-described libertarians also call themselves conservative. 36% called themselves moderate, and 31% called themselves liberal. So they are scattered in almost perfectly. Sir, Mr. Mitchell.
Thanks. I'm Garrett Mitchell, and I write the Mitchell Report. And I want to say that my first reaction in the sort of top line reading of this survey was as opposed to Brink's observation about libertarians kind of relatively happy with things the way they are, et cetera, was that this must have become a terrible place for white evangelicals to live. You look at their scores on everything, and they're really very unhappy about almost everything. The question that I've been sort of thinking about in terms of the litany of opinions expressed here is, I was thinking about the work that Michael Sandel has been doing recently on justice, which Henry mentioned, and in particular, the important observation, I think, that he makes about how we are migrating from being a market economy to a market society, where which adds an important dimension to this notion about the Gini factor and what's happening with wealth in this country, that it is giving people access to everything from HOV lanes to now upgrades in prisons, et cetera. Where not just libertarians, but the groupings that you've talked about this morning would see themselves on that issue or on that question that Sandel is raising about the move from a market economy to a market society and the implications to what that means to a democracy. I mean, what would libertarians, having said there's no such thing as a position, but I'm just interested to get a sense of where libertarians and others measured in this survey might be on that Sandel question.
I'm not sure I've got a concrete answer for you. I mean, I have to try to think a little bit more, and maybe more than I can do on my feet right now, about what all is loaded into, what it means for it to be a market society, right? So from a market economy to a market society, I'm guessing that can mean a whole lot of things. So I don't know if you could help me sharpen it up to like, okay, that would mean this. I don't know, Bill, you got a take on this?
Well, yes, I do.
All right, well, pass it to Bill then.
Well, I mean, the core idea of a market society, as Sandel construes it, is that almost without exception, everything is for sale, right? That everything is within the sphere of exchange, and its worth is equivalent to its value in the market, period, full stop. And I think a lot of people have an instinctive aversion to the idea that, for example, transplant organs should go to the highest bidder. Just take a classic Sandel example. But here's the problem. The late comedian Henny Youngman asked what I think is the single most important principle of politics in a politically incorrect joke, which I will now take the liberty of repeating. It's a two-line joke. Line one, how's your wife? Line two, compared to what? And compared to what is always the right question. And if people have to choose between a market society and a government society, if those are the two choices on offer, and if government remains as unpopular as it is now, I think the center of gravity of American politics will lead us toward a market society willy-nilly, a trend that I'm unhappy about. But I think that's what's going on right now. If the alternative to exchange is government regulation or government prescription, government is going to have to get a lot more popular and a lot more effective and efficient in order to come out the systematic winner in that trade. There is, of course, an additional view that neither coercion nor exchange is the right principle for society, but there has to be a third motivating principle, call it unforced reciprocity or something of that sort. But that is in very short supply, regrettably.
This gentleman over here, and then I want to ask all the way in the front, I'm sorry,
sorry.
go ahead.
Can I answer a quick question?
Yeah.
All right. Matthew Arbos, I have a question. I believe the Virginia gubernatorial election was brought up, and it's kind of going back to the demographics, the fusionism. Mr. Cuccinelli tried to combine the Tea Party, social conservative, libertarian wing, and he was endorsed by Ron Paul, Rand Paul, and it sort of backfired. And Mr. George Will wrote a column endorsing Mr. Robert Sarvis, saying he's the true conservative libertarian. And it appears that Mr. McCall, the Democrat's going to win next week, and it's kind of that split happening. I was wondering if you have any comments on that.
Can we hold that? I want this gentleman to come in, and then I want to ask a closing question that's related to your question. So thank you.
Rafael DeGennaro, briefly, Carlin, could you speak to the libertarian gender gap? I think it was kind of extraordinary. We took half the population off the table at the very beginning of this event. And for anybody, to what extent are these snapshot poll results amenable to conversation? I'm not a libertarian, I'm not a Ron Paul supporter, but I think he did an incredible service in just standing up in the Republican debates in 2012 talking about interventionism. One could argue that the fact that we're not at war with Syria right now is a result of what he did. And so some of these things can be changed by people being educated.
Thank you, sir. Let me just, in terms of the Virginia race, put the question I wanted on the table. I mean, just briefly, I think that Cuccinelli is so identified with social conservatism that has been a primary reason why he's running so weakly, although it's worth noting that he's also being hurt by other kinds of conservatism like gun control, and that I think that in Northern Virginia, if the party goes too far to the right, either to the Tea Party right or the Libertarian right, I think it threatens itself among middle-of-the-road suburban voters. But that leads me to what I was going to add to this list, which is, I found your numbers on 2012 really fascinating, and I can't, before we go, we can't lose the punditry opportunity.
2016, you mean?
I mean, 2016, thank you. See, I'm still trying to work in the 50s. I've still got that in my head. And that it particularly revealing, and I'll let you go last. I'll just go down the panel because I know Bill has to leave. Is the split between the Libertarians and the Tea Party folks, the Cruz-Paul split, was really interesting. And Christie having relatively equal support across the board. There was something very interesting about that. I'd just like you to explore that. Can I start with Bill for any closing comments on these questions or anything else so that you can get out in a timely fashion?
Well, since you asked about 2016, EJ, let me just share with you some very remarkable candidate-centered findings from this survey, specifically about Chris Christie. There's always been a question as to whether the kind of support across the board that he enjoys in New Jersey could be taken national. And according to this survey, the answer would appear to be yes. I mean, consider the following. Among Democrats, Christie enjoys 38% favorable to 35% unfavorable. You can't find a lot of other Republicans who are going to enjoy those sorts of favorables among Democrats. Among liberals, he gets an even split, 41-42. If a candidate like that were able to make his way through a Republican primary, said candidate would be a formidable foe in the general election.
Thank you. Let me, why don't I just go right up the line, and anybody, either on Virginia or on this gentleman's question on Paul, or anything else. Henry.
On the 2016 question, I didn't surprise me too much. Libertarians can see where Ron Paul's heart is. Tea Party, if anything, is characterized by an anger and a willingness to fight at all costs, and certainly Ted Cruz has, in the last few months, jumped to the forefront on that. But don't forget that when we actually see a nominating process, momentum is important, positioning is important, and there are two factions of the Republican Party, the moderates and the evangelicals, who do not have an obvious champion right now. It wouldn't be shocking to me if there was not somebody who would be an evangelical first choice, since every 4 years somebody comes out to claim that mantle, whether it's Mike Huckabee or, oddly enough, the pre-Vatican II Rick Santorum became the evangelical choice of, in 2012. So when that happens, when right now everybody is competing either for the Republican establishment, the Libertarian faction, or the Tea Party faction, that basically leaves 45 to 50% of the Republican Party unrepresented. When somebody comes up and grabs that mantle, all these numbers will change.
Nothing surprising about Rand Paul coming first amongst libertarians in 2016 handicapping. He's certainly amongst those potential candidates, the one most sounding libertarian themes and most trying to inject new libertarian themes into the Republican Party. On the Virginia election, I'll confess I haven't been following it very closely because, well, I have a sensitive stomach. But I did read something in Slate yesterday that said that the McAuliffe campaign was saying that Sarvis was a net negative for them. So I don't know if that's true, but that's interesting. That it's not just that this is a straight defection from the Cuccinelli camp, that Sarvis is drawing from both sides.
Carlin, I'd love you to take up the male question and female, and if I can just add to that real quick. It struck me looking at polls for a long time that if it's a sort of, these are in some ways artificial dimensions, but if it's liberty v. compassion, men tilt to liberty, women tilt compassion. If it's individualism, community, men tilt to individualism, women tilt toward community. Is that sort of broadly right?
That's absolutely right. I mean, the gender gap is a hardy perennial of our politics. You see it in virtually every demographic group, but I've never seen it as large as this libertarian gender gap. That's just huge in terms of the gender gap overall. Quick question, Henry mentioned momentum and positioning. I think intensity is also really important in these early primaries, and I'd say at this point, Rand Paul and Ted Cruz look to be at least leading candidates in that term.
Thank you.
Well, one of the things I love is that we get to talk about Michael Sandel and other kinds of, big ideas. But one other one I'll just throw out here is this firing in my mind on the gender gap is back to the kind of Kohlberg, Carol Gilligan debates in psychology and what counts for sort of justice and what counts for right treatment of others, and the gender differences in those studies that had to do with women taking, or girls in those studies taking relationships and the context more into account, and men were like, no, this is right, it's always right, this is what it is, doesn't matter about the context, and so some of this may in that whole sort of nature nurture debate about all of that, how much of it is born and how much of it is learned. The other one I just want to point out to that, so I don't completely skip your question about the market society, that one question we had that was a big general question that I found astounding because it's a 7-point scale, and on every point of the scale, the country is evenly divided. So there's nearly as many ones as there are sevens, as many twos as there are sixes, as many threes as there are fives, as many fours right in the middle. Is this fundamental question that has two options. The government in Washington should see to it that every person has a good job and a good standard of living. That's one option. The government should just let each person get ahead on their own, is the other option, right? 35%. If you combine all the 1 through 3s, the government in Washington should see to it that every person has a job and a good standard of living. 37%, the 5 through 6s, the government should just let each person get ahead on their own. 25% right in the middle on number 4. So this kind of fundamental divide on this very, very basic question. And then the last thing in Virginia, the last poll I saw was Quinnipiac University of likely voters last week had Sarvis pulling 11% of Republicans and 2% of Democrats in Virginia. So.
I just want to thank one tweeter, Daniel Rothschild, who wrote, if the questions at hashtag AVS 2013 are any indication, Brookings Institution could profitably host a whole event called Ask a Libertarian. And so I want to thank Brink for being as close as we could to playing that role here. I want to thank Carlin and Henry and Bill and above all, Robbie, for providing so much food for thought. We will keep digging through this data and hope to have more from you shortly. So thank you all very much. Thank you all for coming.